I'm a
I'm sorry.
media artist based out of Toronto. And today I'm going to take you through a step-by-step watercolor demonstration on how to paint a blooming peony. But before I do so, I'm going to take you through some really important fundamentals because I could easily just teach you the step-by-step, you leave with just the painting. But if you want to continue your watercolor journey, the things that I'm going to share with you are really important. So how to use warm and cool colors, how to use intentional layering, controlled wet on wet techniques, and how to mix shadows effectively for both an open peony and a closed bud. I'll also go a little bit into color temperature theory, pigment mixing, and how to keep your washes really vibrant with watercolor by working from light to dark. So I'll just show you if you could switch to my desk view.
Absolutely.
I'm just going to really quickly run through the sample kit and the additional materials that I'm using. So in your sample kit, you should have received a sheet of Arch watercolor paper, the reference image, a Lyra pencil, graphite pencil, the Princeton Aqua Elite round size 10, two red Aquafine colors, and some of the additional materials that I'm using that will be important from working with this from start to finish are I have two water containers, two large water containers, one that's just for dirty water and one's for clean water, so it's good for my washes. I do have an extra sheet of watercolor paper. If you have one handy, great. It'll be important when we're doing some of the warm-up techniques. And then in addition to that, I have my ultramarine blue deep, my cerulean blue, my, what is this? Cadmium yellow, and my Indian yellow. If you have paper towel, you can use that. I prefer to use a rag because especially with watercolor, you can reuse this. You can throw it in the wash, clean it. So it's really nice and easy, better for the environment. I have painter's tape. Really important to use painter's tape instead of masking tape. They are different adhesives, so you may find that if with masking tape, you just have to be a lot more careful when you're removing it because it may tear the paper slightly. So painter's tape, if you have it, is great. Any extra mixing space, you can use palette paper, you can use a plate, you can use an empty mixing container. And then some of the other brushes I'm using. So I do have an eraser handy and a ballpoint pen. If you don't have a ballpoint pen, it's no problem. This is just for when we're transferring this image onto our watercolor paper. I like to use a pen because I just find it easier to see, but you can also just use your pencil. And then I'm using three other brushes. So I have a Neptune round size 10. So it's a little bit different from the Aqua Elite. And I'll go into that more later, the difference between the two hairs. And then I have a wash brush. This wash brush specifically, this is the square wash with Neptune, same with Princeton. And you'll see it has an edge on the end. So I'll go into how we can use that and why you may want to use that in your watercolor pieces. And then lastly, I have the oval wash, also with Princeton Neptune. This brush is fantastic for florals because of its brush shape. You'll see it's a little bit more, it's a flat, but it's tapered off towards the top. So you can really get some really nice line work if you're doing petals and if you're doing leaves. And I did just see a question. If you don't have an extra watercolor sheet, you can use the top portion or the bottom portion of your sheet. Really what we're going to be doing is just swatching the colors, and I'm going to be going into how to use the warm and cool colors and just kind of getting to know the pigments because they vary between brands. You may see an ultramarine in one brand look completely different from another one. So it's important when before you go into a piece of work, you're testing your products, getting to know the color mixes a little bit. I always think of it like if you're going to go for a run, you're going to do a quick stretch first. Or if you're going to write a paper, you're going to do your research first. So it's important to get that warm up even when you're painting. So we'll start off here. I'm going to grab my spare piece of paper, or you can use the top of your sheet. So I'm going to use my Aqua Elite round, and all I'm going to do is I'm going to swatch these colors. And as I swatch these colors, I'm going to talk a little bit about them. So I'm first going to swatch the cadmium yellow. So I'm going to really saturate my brush. And then I'm going to do one single stroke, clean my brush off, kind of blot it a little bit so I don't have too much excess water. And then I'm just going to carry that color down. I need a little more water. I'm going to carry that color down so I can see the transparency. So it makes a gradient effect. And I'm going to continue to do that with all my colors. So the cadmium yellow is my warm yellow. Now I'm going to swatch the Indian yellow. So same thing, I'm going to start with a lot of pigment on my brush. Clean my brush off, blot it a little bit, and then carry down that pigment. Now I'm going to use my alizarin crimson, same thing. And as I go, I'm just going to write underneath the color name and that this is my warm yellow. This is my cool yellow. So the alizarin is going to be my cool red. Now I'll go through, swatch my cadmium red. This is my warm red. And something to keep in mind when I am referring to these as cool and warm, that is all relative. So when I'm swatching these colors, yes, this may be a warm red, but beside another color, it may appear cooler. So you have to keep that in mind when you're selecting your colors. These colors I've picked because these are my go-to colors, regardless of the subject that I'm using. If I'm doing a floral, if I'm doing a landscape, it is always these colors because when you have a warm and cool color of all the primaries, you can virtually mix any color. If they are a good quality paint, then you are good. And I find if you have a really broad palette of a ton of different colors, it becomes overwhelming, especially when you're just starting. You want to limit your palette, and you can even just use, if you're starting out, you can even just use 3 primaries and that's it. This is my ultramarine blue. I love ultramarine blue because it's a granulating pigment. What that means is you'll see a little bit of texture in the finish. So it gives a really nice effect to your work. And then my last one here is the cerulean blue.
Kelly, I've got some questions here about some of the colors. First, are there substitutes for Indian yellow, other yellows in the range like gamboge?
Yep, so that's a great substitute that you can use because it's a little bit cooler of a yellow. So if you have that, you can absolutely use that.
Another question. Somebody's mentioning that they thought that Indian yellow was warm because of the red incorporated into that.
So again, it's all relative. So if you look at my cadmium yellow, that is my warm yellow because it is, you can see how it has a little bit more, it has a lot more yellow to it and almost a little bit of green. So it actually is my warmer yellow in comparison to my Indian.
Great. Thank you.
There's a really great book. An artist, Cami Mendlick is her name. She has a book called Color Relativity. It is fantastic. It's more directed for oil paint, but it's one that I follow, and she's a really talented artist. If you haven't heard of her. So now that I have my swatches down, I'm just going to kind of experiment with the colors a little bit. So what I do before I go into a piece is I do a little bit of a warm up by going through each area of my painting. So a general rule of thumb for temperature, your warmer colors will be the first thing your eye catches. So you'll notice I focus a lot of the warmth around the top of my petals and a lot of the cooler warm and cooler purples around the base. So what I'm going to do for my petals, before I start with my wash, so this is one that I've started to work on. So you'll see the first thing that I do is I start with kind of an Indian yellow in the middle and use that same gradient effect that we were just using. So I start with a lot of pigment in the middle to concentrate that color, and then I'll use just water to blend it outwards. And what this will do is in my more transparent layers, so towards the top of my petals, that yellow will really shine through. So this is a technique I'll use a lot. And because watercolor is a transparent medium, having those colors underneath that just pop through is really, really nice. So for the petals, for the undertone, what I did was I diluted cadmium yellow or Indian yellow, depending on the glow that you want. So I'm gonna use my Indian yellow, and I'm just gonna experiment with how it looks. So I'm gonna take a really diluted wash. Hopefully you can see it. So it's really, really subtle. You don't want it to be too pigment heavy. And then I'll show you what the cadmium yellow looks like. You could also use a combination of the two, so that's too dark. So that's too much pigment. You'll find a little bit of these colors go a really long way because they are very pigmented. So just keep that in mind when you're playing around with them. And I find it helpful when I am doing this. I'll just note what I did. So I'll do for the petals, under layer, Indian yellow or cad yellow. If you want your peony to give off the impression that it's a really warm, sunny day, kind of midday, then you want to use that cadmium yellow because that will really make it pop. If you want it to be a little bit more of an overcast day, then use your Indian yellow. So now for the petals. So for the petals, what I'm gonna use my alizarin and I'm gonna use my cadmium red. For the cooler shadows and more soft pinks and inner petals, I'm gonna use the alizarin. For more sunlit and warm facing for the outer petals, I'm gonna use my cadmium red. So all I'm gonna do here is I'm just gonna do a combination of those two colors. Ooh, and I do this all the time. I'll always go back and forth between my two water containers. I'll forget which one's dirty, which one's clean, but that's okay. So I'm going to mix those two. This is going to be my transition color for the petals. Okay. So I'm just going to note, so alizarin for cooler shadows and soft pinks in inner petals. And then for my cadmium red, and what I love about these notes, they can be messy. It doesn't matter. It's just a warm up. It's just kind of getting your brain into it and getting ready for the painting process. So sunlit, cadmium red is for my sunlit, warm facing outer petals. So all that I'm going to do here in the side is just a practice. So I'm going to put a little bit of my alizarin down. And then I'm going to take some of my cadmium red and I'm just going to put it over top and let those colors blend and just see how they are together. And then I'll just take some clean water and just create a little bit of a gradient just to see what that transition looks like if I blend it out and it becomes a little bit more diluted. Okay, so now we're going to move into the shadows. So for my shadow colors, the shadows are something that you use at the end. So we're working in a layering process. So the first layer that we're going to do is this yellow. Then once that's dry, we're going to move into our reds. And then once that's dried, that's when we go and lay down our purples and our deeper colors. So for the shadows, I used a few different ones. So I used a combination of alizarin and ultramarine blue, and that's a much cooler blue. That's for inside the bloom. So right here. I'm going to take a little bit of my ultramarine blue, a little bit of my alizarin. And if you find it's a little bit too on the red side, just add some more ultramarine. There we go. Just going to jot that down. So that is ultramarine and alizarin for cool purple inside the bloom. Because remember, with the cooler tones, that's going to push everything back. Now for a slightly warmer purple, this is more for mid-tones and for some more soft shape. I'm going to be using a combination of cadmium red and ultramarine blue.
Kelly, the cadmium red and the vermilion, they are very similar in color. What would you say the difference between the two are?
So I would say the difference between the two, I'll just show you a painted version. So so they're both more opaque colors. So there's the cadmium red light, that would be an opaque. The vermilion is the one that you have in your set. It is also an opaque. The red that we are using is a cadmium red, which is transparent. So the biggest difference between the two would be that there's a transparent and an opaque. Typically, I try to use, with my limited palette, I'll try to use a combination of semi-transparents, transparents, and opaques. So if you do have your vermilion, you can use that in place of your cadmium red hue. Just keep in mind that it is more opaque, so you may just have to dilute it a little bit more for your wax.
Thanks.
So just mixing my warmer purple here with cadmium red and ultramarine. This is slightly warmer. This is for midtones and soft shape. So now we'll move into our leaf and stem. So there are a few different greens that I'll use. Cadmium yellow and cerulean gives you a really bright, vibrant spring green. So this is really good for young leaves. So I'll mix that here. So my cadmium yellow and my cerulean. Add yellow, cerulean for young leaves. And then I'll still use my cadmium yellow, but I'll use my cadmium yellow and ultramarine blue for a little bit more of an olive toned for shadow. So because this is a blooming peony, we're gonna really just focus on these two greens because it's a young plant. But if you were doing, say, one that was more mature, and that some of maybe the foliage and the edges have aged a little bit, then you would use almost closer to a brown. It would be more of an olive tone, but closer to a brown. So this one here for the shadows, this was cadmium yellow with ultramarine blue, which gives you an olive tone for a shadow. Okay. So this is a really great reference tool as you're working through your image. And I just want to note something before we start drawing. Just a couple things that I'll do. There's this isn't something that I made up. This has been in the watercolor community for I don't know how long, probably before I was born. But there's an analogy that you can use that's really, really helpful. And that's referring to the consistency of the paint as tea, coffee, milk, cream, and butter. Tea would be more water. I'll hold this a little bit closer. Tea would be more water, less pigment, and butter would pretty much be right out of the tube. So this would be more pigment. This is a really great reference to keep as well, because your light values will always be in a tea and coffee consistency. Your mid values will always be in a coffee and milk consistency, and your dark values will always be in a milk and cream consistency. And how you can test this, you're probably saying, how do I know? How do I know what the consistency is if I'm just using it? So one thing that I'll do is I'll get my palette. So I'm going to do a tea consistency to start. Okay, so tea consistency is a lot of water, but just enough to see the pigment. So when we're doing a wash, typically that's a tea consistency. So what I'll do is I'll hold my paper on an angle a little bit, and I'll just continue to add water. If it flows really easily and beads up, that is your tea consistency. Now, if I add a little bit more pigment for a little bit more body, but it's still really watery. So it still flows easy. It's just typically a little darker in value. This is also really great for washes, but this would be your coffee consistency. Now, your milk consistency, I'm gonna add some more pigment here. This is a lot thicker, so this is more pigment. This is still would be considered a mid value. So it's still flowing on my palette, but there's not enough water in it for it to be a wash. Now my cream consistency is where my darks come in. So there's more pigment, enough water for to still create a wash. But do you see when I move that pigment around, it takes the excess out of the water. You take the excess out of the bristles, and it really doesn't move on my palette if I turn it or if I tilt it. Okay, so that is my cream. Butter consistency, I rarely use. You want to use it so sparingly. The only time I will really use a butter consistency is if I'm doing a highlight or some textural effects after my work is complete. So just an example of that, if I'm doing a landscape and I just want to add like a light shimmer in the water, maybe of a warm yellow, then I will use that butter consistency, but just in a small area. You don't want to overdo it. I've had so many pieces where I'll get carried away with it, like everything else with painting. Sometimes you just struggle to know when to stop. And then it just completely ruins the painting. So you really do want to use it so sparingly. And something just to keep in mind when you are working with these consistency, they'll behave on a dry surface a lot differently than a damp or a wet surface. So hold this up a little closer. So this is my tea consistency here. This is how it looks on a dry piece of paper. Okay, so you'll see I have some really crisp edges, but then in my damp, you'll see it spreads out a little bit more. And then in my wet, it spreads instantly. So I have less control when I'm using my consistencies on a wet piece of paper than I do on a damp piece of paper or a dry piece of paper. So this is my tea consistency. This is my milk consistency. So you'll see the difference between the damp and the wet. It really feathers out. And then my butter consistency. So you'll see the butter consistency on a wet surface. It actually does give some really nice effects because you get some of that dry brushing, but it also feathers out in some edges too. So just something to keep in mind. And one thing when you are working through these consistencies, the reason I'm talking about it so much is because when we're doing the petals and I'm adding colors, so say I add my cadmium yellow, okay? Or sorry, my cadmium red. If I go in, so that's probably a coffee to milk consistency. Now, if I go in and I'm just going to go in with water because I just want to show you what will happen. But if I go in with a color when it's still wet or when it's damp, and it has more water in it and it's more of a tea consistency and has more water than pigment, you'll get a cauliflower. So you see what happens when I'm adding more water, how it caused, there's a light reflection, but it'll cause the paint to move away from that water, and then you'll get a cauliflower finish. So if you've ever seen artists that use a salt technique to suck up the pigment and suck up the water, and it creates little almost starbursts, you'll get that same effect with this, which is a great effect if you want it to be there. But just keep that in mind because if you don't want it to be there, then you want to avoid that. Okay, so we'll finally move into the artwork. So I'm going to keep my reference close to me. I'm just gonna lay out my colors. So I want my warm yellow, my cool yellow, my alizarin, my cadmium red, my ultramarine blue, and my cerulean. So I'm kind of going warm yellow, cool red, warm red, cool blue. Okay. So what you're gonna do, this is probably my favorite method with transferring images. So what I'll do, because watercolor paper is so delicate, so I never draw directly onto the watercolor paper because if I'm erasing, if I'm pressing too hard with my pencil, then I'm gonna create creases and it's gonna affect the texture of the watercolor paper. So what I do is I will draw out an image just on sketching paper before, and then I'll outline it once I'm happy with it with a Sharpie. That's just an optional step. I just do that to darken the image so I can see it more clearly. And then all we're gonna do is we're gonna get our graphite pencil. And so you know which side of the paper to draw on. So there'll be two different textures. They're very similar because the Arch watercolor paper, it is the closest to handmade as it can get because it's made through a mold machine rather than a forge ironer machine. So you'll see with this paper, it has a lot of irregular texture. That's what you want with a watercolor paper. So I'm gonna look, so this is my backside, and the reason that I can tell is because it's slightly smoother. So I'm gonna flip it onto the front, and all I'm gonna do is with my reference image that's just on regular printing paper, I've already gone ahead and drawn with the graphite, but all you're gonna do is go through and just make sure all the lines of the drawing are covered. And again, using that Sharpie is nice because you can see the image through the back, so you don't have to over sketch. So I'm quickly gonna cover that. And the reason we're using a 9B pencil is because 9B pencil gives off, it's a lot softer of a graphite. If you were using an HB pencil, this would take forever and the transfer would be a lot lighter. So with this, you don't have to press as hard with the transfer once we're moving the image onto the watercolor paper. And I'll usually just rotate the pencil around because it's softer, it does get worn down quicker, but you can just continue to rotate it so you can get a new edge. Okay. All right. So now what I'm going to do is I'm going to take this image. I want my stem to be at the bottom of the page, but if you did do the warm-up exercise on the bottom, you can just move this above. So I'm going to put mine at the bottom and then using my painter's tape or masking tape, all I'm going to do is take a piece. And what I usually do just to get the adhesive down a little bit, I'll just put it on the outside of my hand, take it off, and then I'm just going to do the top edge and maybe a little bit on the side. So same thing, just to get some of the adhesive off. Okay. And now what I'm going to do is I'm just going to outline my flower. So I'll use the pen just because you can see it a lot easier, but if you don't have a pen, you can use your pencil. If you kind of forget where you're drawing, you can lift your page and then just view underneath. So I just saw, is it cheating to trace? So that's a really good question, and that's a question that you hear a lot from artists because there's different opinions. So this you can draw it yourself if you'd like to, but as I said, so I did draw this. I just drew it first on sketch paper, and then I'm transferring that onto my final work paper, my watercolor paper, because I don't want to go and ruin my watercolor paper by using excessive erasing or excessive line work that's going to indent my watercolor paper. But I also think, I don't think that it's cheating to trace in general, just because I think if you care more about the painting process than the drawing process, by all means, trace. There's no rules, in my opinion. There's no rules. Do whatever you feel comfortable with. Okay, so I'm pretty happy with the transfer. Well, I did miss a petal here, so that's good that you can go back and check. Let's see. Okay, yeah, that looks good. So I'm gonna gently remove this now. So during this painting process, I'm gonna go through kind of sporadically in each area. So I'm gonna jump from petal to leaf to inside the bloom, just so I can show you the different techniques, because I don't want you to feel rushed as you're painting through this. I want you to be able to get kind of all the information you need and then take your time painting. So first thing that we're going to do, what I talked about earlier. So we're going to start off with that inside bright yellow. So I want it to be a really bright day. For this one, I did use the Indian yellow, so I'm going to switch it up a little bit. So I'm going to use my wash brush. If you don't have a wash brush, don't worry about it. You can use your round brush. So what I'm going to do, I'm going to grab, this is a little dirty, so I'm just going to clean this off a little bit. Okay. So I want this to be really diluted. So I'm taking my cadmium yellow and I want this to be that tea consistency, right? So I'm just going to slightly tilt it. So it is runny. So I'm going to take that, I'm going to focus it on the inside of my bloom. Okay. I'm going to clean my brush. And then with my clean water, I'm just going to do that gradient effect that we were doing earlier. And I'm just going to move some of that pigment towards the outside of my bloom. If you wanted to, you could also bring this, I'm just focusing it on the flower, but you could also bring this down to the petals. So I may not, if I were to do this, I may not do the stem. I may just do the leaf because it's a little bit more, it would be more transparent. You'd be able to see through the leaf a lot more than a stem. So you know what I'll do? I'll bring that cadmium yellow and I'll just do my leaves really diluted. You want to keep it really light. Okay. And you'll see these leaves here. I'm just focusing it on the edge of the leaf because around that it would be a lot more shadowed. So I don't want it quite as warm in that area. For this bloom, because it's still blooming and it's a closed peony, I'm gonna dilute my cadmium yellow even more. Because this would be, in general, this would be a lot cooler because there's not as much light transferring through it. So I'm just doing a really diluted yellow. Okay. So I would use my hair dryer, but I don't want to, I want to save everybody's ears. So I'm just going to use a spare piece of paper. I won't use my artwork, but I'll use a spare piece of paper and I'll just fan it. But if you have a hair dryer, feel free to use it. And then just use your index finger. The reason you use your index finger is because, or sorry, your ring finger is because it has the lightest touch. So mine's still pretty wet. This is starting to dry. So you can see the image on my left here. You're really focusing on one petal at a time. That's pretty good. Okay. So referring back to our notes, so for the petals, I'm using my alizarin crimson for my cooler shadows and soft pinks in the inner petals. And then for my sunlit, warm-facing outer petals, I'm using my cadmium red. So I'm going to grab these two because I'm just going to focus on these colors to start. And again, if you don't have your cadmium red, then you can use your vermilion, just dilute it a little bit more than you would your cadmium red because it is opaque, whereas this one is transparent. Okay, so I'm gonna focus on one petal. So we have a couple different options here for brushes. So I will go back and forth between my Princeton Neptune and my Princeton Aqualite. And the reason being, even though they're the same shape, same size, they're different hairs. So my Princeton Neptune, this is a synthetic squirrel. So it holds a lot of water in the belly, and it's a lot softer of a brush. So these kinds of these kinds of hairs are really great for wash layers. Your Aqualite would be a synthetic Kolinsky sable. So these are two hairs that are really popular in watercolor. It does hold a lot of water, not quite as much as the Neptune, but it holds a really fine point. So it's really great for detail work. So I'm going to switch to my Neptune, but if you don't have a Neptune brush, you can continue to use your Aqualite round. And all I'm going to do is I'm going to wet just a single petal. So I'm going to start with this larger petal here. And you don't want it to be so wet that you see pooling water, okay? So I'm going to wet this area. And what this is called, this is a wet on wet technique that we're going to be using for the petals. So I'm going to take I'm going to move this out of the way. I'm going to take my alizarin crimson because that is my cooler red. That's the red that I want at the base of my stems. And I'm going to concentrate it towards the bottom of my stem. And you'll see because I'm using a wet on wet technique, that color is starting to feather upwards.
Kelly, can you briefly just raise the image just a little bit so we can see the area that you're working on?
Yeah. So I'm
Oh,
doing
that's
this
great.
petal here. So I'm focusing that alizarin crimson at the bottom, and then I'm going to use my transitional color. Here, I can bring this closer actually. Is that better?
And that's fantastic.
So the key with watercolor is you need to work slowly. You need to allow the watercolor and the paint to travel and just kind of let it do its own thing. So this is traveling as it continues to spread through the water. So I'm going to do my transitional color now. So I'm going to do my alizarin and my cadmium red. And I'm just gonna drop that in. I'm still leaving a lot of that top petal because you'll see in this picture here, I almost preserve that diluted yellow that we used at the beginning. So now now that I've done my transitional color, I'm gonna go in with my cadmium red, and I'm just gonna drop that in. And I'm going closer to the edge of my petal, but I'm gonna let it travel on its own. Okay, so now I'm just gonna leave that petal, let it do its thing, let the colors kind of mesh together, and I'm gonna move on to a next petal. So the key when I'm going to another petal, I don't wanna do the one that's beside it because this area is still wet. So all my colors will blend together and then it'll become kind of messy. So I'm going to move up to my top petal here. Now, with this top petal, I'm not really going to use a lot of my alizarin because this would be just the edge of the petal, right? So a lot of that light would be shining through there. So I'm going to use a really diluted um, cadmium red. Getting all my colors mixed up here. And I'm going to wet the area first. So same as I did with the other petal. So working a wet on wet technique. And I am carrying some of that color in from my water. So that's why going back, it is very important to keep separate waters and try not to mix them up if you can, because I have done that and now I'm carrying some of my tinted water in here, but that's okay. So I'm still trying to preserve some of that yellow. I'm going to drop in a really diluted cadmium red, kind of towards the base of that edge, and then just let it travel upwards. And remember, you can always go darker. It's better for your colors to keep them as more of a tea and coffee consistency to start. Okay, so you see how light that is, and you see how much that is that closer? Is that better? You can see how well that light is shining through. Okay. So I've done my petal that's both in shadow and in light, my petal edge that's more in light. Now I'm gonna do a petal that would be a lot cooler and is more in the dark. So my bloom here, you'll see how much cooler of a tone it is. So what I'm gonna do is I'm gonna do this inside petal here. So I'm gonna do the same thing. I'm gonna wet the inside. Just that inside petal there. I'm gonna grab my alizarin crimson. I'm gonna focus it on the base, but I'm gonna really push this base upward because I'm not really gonna be using a lot of that, the cadmium red, because this will be so much cooler and covered in shadow because there's not a lot of light going through this bud. And you'll see how beautiful that is, just feathering upward. So I'm just gonna leave it because I like that effect. Because if you look really closely at a peony or any flower for that matter, you can see those veins throughout the flowers. If you did want to enhance that a little bit, you could use your wash brush and you could use the scraper. So I will use this if I'm doing landscapes, if I'm doing grass, or if I'm doing highlights on a piece of work. When it's more damp, you use your scraper, use the end. And I'm just scraping the paper. And what this does, it creates a crease in your paper so that that pigment falls into that area. So I'll hold it up a little bit closer. You'll be able to see it more when it's dry, but you can already see how nice that looks. And it's such an easy way of getting some really nice details. Okay. So I'm going to jump now. So I've done my leaf that's in shadow and light, my edge of my leaf that's just in light, my more shadowed leaf, and then I'm going to jump to my stem here. So still using that wet on wet technique. We will be using a wet on dry technique for our shadows, but for the wash layer and the initial layers of just getting color down, wet on wet technique is really all that I use for botanical work anyway. So for the leaf and stem, because this would really all be a young leaf. So I'm going to use my cadmium yellow and cerulean to get my bright spring green. And I'm going to use a little bit of my cad yellow with ultramarine blue for my olive tone and shadow. I'm just going to roll this back just so I have some more mixing space. So my cadmium yellow and my cerulean. Again, I'm just dropping that color in, and because I'm working wet on wet, it's going to spread on its own. So I started with more of a tea consistency, and while it's still wet, I'm gonna drop in more of a milk consistency. So I'll show you my palette. So all that I'm doing here in the corner is I'm just adding more of this pigment to get it to that kind of milk consistency. And you'll see I'm focusing a lot more of the color in the center because I, again, want to try and preserve some of that lighter yellow. If you do find you put too much pigment, don't worry, you can take just a clean brush, blot it a little bit, and then you can lift off some of that pigment to get some of that yellow back. And you'll see here, so I'll just show you, if I made a mistake, which they will happen, use clean water. And all I'm gonna do is wet that area. And then with a rag, I'm gonna lift some of that pigment off. And then you can just continue to do that until you completely lift it off. The Arch paper is really durable, so you can really scrub at it to lift that pigment. And this is again why it's important to have clean water. So I'm going to continue with that milk consistency of that green that I created. So that's the cerulean and the cadmium yellow. And I'm going to bring that down my stem. So when you're doing this more detail work, this would be a good opportunity with the Aqua because it has more of a finer point to switch to that brush. So I'm still going to go back into my milk consistency, but you'll see the difference in the stroke, how it's just a lot finer. I have a little bit more control. And you'll see, so I just went in with more pigment from my cerulean and my cadmium yellow, and you'll see that it's a lot different than the color that I had before. That makes for a way more interesting painting. When you're going back into your work, try to experiment with some variation. I'll always try to add a little bit more of one of the colors that I was using whenever I go back into a piece, just for a little bit more interest. Okay, so now you can really see the veins that I was doing earlier. See how beautiful that is. And that was so effortless to do that. So when it's wet, use a scraper. If you don't, you can also use a hard edge if you have one, but this just makes it so much easier because it's on the back of your brush. So now that these are dry, I'm just gonna go in and show you how I would do the shadow on this leaf here. Okay, so I'm gonna go in and I'm gonna re-wet this area, but just really lightly. I don't want to completely saturate this area with water. So just to richen up the colors a little bit, I'm going to go back in with my alizarin. And I'm going to drop in some of that color. And you'll see my stroke has changed a little bit. So it's a little bit more directional. So as you move towards the end of a piece, your strokes like this become a little bit more intentional. So the key with our initial layers, we're just getting the color down, but now I'm doing some directional strokes because what that will do, that same feathering that we got here, and because we're working a wet on wet technique, that's going to give that vein impression as well. So I'm focusing that color and I'm kind of flicking my brush towards the end of my petal. And that color is just going to travel upward. And then I can do the same thing. Well, since this is wet, I can get some more textural effects and push some of that color upward with my scraper. And if I did want to soften any of those edges a bit, I could take a clean brush and then just move some of that pigment around, soften some areas. So you'll see with the Neptune brush, you'll see it doesn't have, it's a lot softer of a brush. It doesn't have the snap that an Aqua Elite would have. So different brushes for different techniques. I'll always go back and forth between the two. So I'm just lightly softening some of these areas. Okay. So I'm going to switch back to my Aqua Elite. This petal is dry, so I'm going to go back to my bloom and I'm going to do the inner of that bloom, just so I'm showing you different areas of the flower, and then you can take your time and go through it. So for my shadow, for the inside of the bloom, I'm going to refer back to my mixing chart. I'm going to use the alizarin and the ultramarine blue. So this is my cool purple for the inside of the bloom. Probably one of my favorite combinations for a purple. So using my Aqua Elite, just because it has more of a fine point, I'm gonna just focus this on the inside of my bloom. And you'll see doing that immediately, my edge of my petal here just really pops forward. So for that part, I didn't wet it. I just went wet on dry. And the reason I did that is I just wanted more control in that area. And because that is, I don't want any really gradient in that area because it's so dark. I want to set that behind. So I just went in just with pigment, no water. So now I'll show you, because this is dry, I'm going to make that area a little bit darker. So I'm going to use my slightly warmer cadmium red and ultramarine blue. And now I'm using what's called a wet on dry. So I'm going in with still a pretty transparent consistency. So more of a coffee consistency. And you'll see I can, because it's still transparent, I can still see the colors underneath, but this is just adding a little bit more depth. So that's how we're going to get the shadows into these petals, is we're going to use our cadmium red and our ultramarine blue. So our slightly warmer, this is more for like our midtones and just softening that shape. So I'm just going to focus that on the edge of this petal, but I did carry that up quite a bit further, more than I would in this opening bloom, just because there wouldn't be as much light traveling through this bloom. So now I'm just going to continue these same processes and do my other petals. And you really want to think, before you do each petal, you really want to try to visualize where that light is coming from. That's really important in order to get more of a realistic look. Actually, I'm going to switch brushes, go back to my Neptune. Still using that wet on wet technique. We'll start with my alizarin. Oh, it's my favorite part. See how nice that is. Watercolor can seem so intimidating when you first start because people think that there's not a lot of room for error. But the key is just patience and getting to know the medium and letting it do its thing.
Kelly, approximately how long did it take you to finish your final paper with all the layers, the drying time, and the like?
Yeah, so that's a good question. So I would say from start to finish, with the layering, and again, like you do work really slowly because you let the colors travel. So I would say from start to finish, maybe a couple hours.
Oh, sounds great.
A lot, if you do have a hair dryer, it does move a lot quicker, but sometimes when I'm doing botanical work and I want the colors to travel on their own, I may kind of shy away from using a hair dryer because I want it to just move naturally and just see kind of what effects I can get that way. So we have about 15 minutes left. So I'm just going to continue these same processes, work through the petals. Before we kind of close up, are there any questions? I'm going to do the shadowing on the stems and the leaves, but is there anything else that you'd like to see that I haven't went over that you think you may want to see before the end of the call? Okay.
I didn't see
So
any yet,
I'm
but
going
I see some of these highlights. You are purposely leaving these areas white, right? Or
yes,
avoid, so that's a lot of dry or wet on
exactly.
dry.
Yeah,
Just
exactly. So just this petal here, that's basically just at the top of this petal is essentially just that diluted cadmium yellow that I used at the beginning. And that's how with botanicals, especially because they're so the flowers are so fine, you really want to see that light shining through it. And it'll just help support the delicate feel of a flower without it may because the tough thing is when you are doing florals, sometimes they look really heavy. So this will help you just kind of keeping an airy feel.
and then for the first petal that you started working on, is that petal done? Or
Yep.
do you go back and do, okay.
Yeah, so this petal's done. If I wanted to, say there was a difference in the lighting when I was doing this, if I was doing kind of plein air and referencing it as I was painting, say the light changes and this ends up being more in shadow and I want to change it a little bit. What I would do is I would go back in still with that same mixture. So similar what we did here with the cadmium red and the ultramarine blue. So that would be my midtones and soft shape shadow. So all I would do is I may say it's coming a little bit more this way. So I would still use those directional strokes. Up towards the tip of my petal. And see how that just rounds it out so much more.
Another question we have is, are you using the same color combos for the back of the blossom versus the shadows of each petal?
Sorry, could you repeat that? It kind of cut out for a second.
Oh, yeah. Are you using the same color combos for the back of the blossom versus the shadows of each petal?
So for the back petals here,
Yes. So these are all the shadows. So it's still considered a shadow, right? That you're
yes, yeah. So that's a really good question. So think of it as so all these layers here, these would be the finest part of the petal, and therefore the most light would be flowing through them. So for this petal here, I really just used a very diluted version of my warm red, so my cadmium red. And you can still see there's a lot of that yellow shining through it. So I want to keep that really as light as possible.
and there's a couple other questions here. One question is, my painting looks a lot brighter. Could it be because it's online, or is this painting very bright, or are the color mixing perhaps not done correctly?
No, it should be very bright. Mine is very bright. It may just be the translation of the through Zoom, but the colors are very pigmented, so it will be a very bright painting.
It's beautiful. And another question here is there anything you can do to fix a cauliflower?
That's a really good question. So what I would do to fix a cauliflower, so I'll do one here quickly just to show you. Actually, I might as well do one on my painting. Do one here. But also, just keep in mind, cauliflower isn't necessarily a bad thing. It can be a really nice technique, especially with botanicals. But if you did want to avoid it, this is how I'd fix it. So I have my pigment down. So adding some water to it. So when that dries, that's going to cauliflower. So all I would do to fix that is I would go in, same with how we fixed an error, but just be sparing with this. Decide if the cauliflower really bothers you or not. If it does, then if it's still wet, try to blot as much off as possible. If it's completely dry, just use that scrubbing technique. Some pigments are staining pigments, so they will be harder to lift. But again, this paper is really durable. So what I would do is I would just completely scrub off that petal and start fresh. Wait for it to dry and start fresh.
Great. Thank you.
So just before we wrap up, feel free to continue asking questions. I'm just going to show you how I would do the shadows. So the key here is continue to layer until if you want it to stay really light, airy, vibrant, then you can. But if you want to add some more depth, some deeper shadows, This is how I would do it. So I would use my cadmium yellow and my ultramarine blue for the stems. So this is my more olive tone. So cadmium yellow here. And I'm going back to my Aqua Elite brush just because I want that snap. Ultramarine blue. So I'm going to really focus, see how dark that is. So I'm going to focus that color, almost a milk consistency, right at the top. And then what I'm going to do is I'm going to clean my brush off. And I don't want it to be as sharp of a shadow. So I'm just going to start to bring that down just with a clean brush. And I want it to be darkest towards the towards my bloom, towards my flower. So I'll go back and dilute that a little bit. And I'm just going to add a little bit more of the cadmium yellow moving down my stem. And so you'll see here, I'm using a wet on dry technique. So for this leaf here, what I'm going to do, I'm going to go back to a wet on wet technique. I'm going to wet this layer so I can let some of that darker green move, create those veins that we were using before for the petals. So I'm going to get my milk consistency of cadmium yellow and ultramarine blue. And I'm just going to brush that color upward. So I'm just going to continue the same processes that we were using and just do each petal at a time and really take your time with it. There's no rush, and it's said watercolor is such a relaxing medium, so enjoy the process.
I was just going to say I could spend the day doing this for all afternoon, but we are getting closer to the end. So I just wanted to see if there are any additional questions out there. Can I answer? Okay. When do you want to use a darker version of the same color versus using a complement for the shadows? That's a great question.
Yeah, good question. So for this, this petal here was a great example. So I started off with my wash layers, so my diluted versions, my tea and my coffee consistency. And then what I did once that was dry is I re-wet that petal, and then I just focused my alizarin crimson in more of a milk consistency and let that travel upward. So that would be for this petal specifically. I'm using a darker version of that same color. I could add shadows like I did just as an example. But in that case, I really kind of want to stick with those initial colors and just darker versions. But the key is I'm not using a darker version of that color if it's up towards the top of the petal because you really want to maintain that transparency through that top of the petal.
Great.
Oh, that's a good
Mm,
question.
yeah,
So actually, you may see a lot of botanical artists use a hot press paper. A hot press paper is completely smooth. There's no texture. So one thing to keep in mind when you are working in watercolor is, do you want that texture to show through your work? A lot of artists that do botanicals or portraits prefer to use hot press because they don't want to see that texture as much through their final work, but it's really all preference. There's hot press, there's cold press, and there's rough. I would say cold press is generally the most popular. But yeah, you just have to experiment and see what works with your style.
great. Okay, so one of our favorite things to do is we love to see the work that you guys have done. We know it's not a complete picture, but if you guys can turn your cameras on and you can switch to a gallery view, we can take a look and see what everyone's been working on today.
Oh yeah, beautiful.
Oh, this is great.
Awesome. If you do feel like sharing your final work with me, I always love to see it. If you are on Instagram, my Instagram is art by Kelly Baskin. If you'd like to send me an image of your work, if you're comfortable, I would love to. I would love to see it.
That's great. Well, thank you, everyone, and thank you, Kelly. We hope everyone got learned something new today, and we hope to see you again soon. Thank you, and have a great afternoon, everyone.
Thank you, everyone, for joining, and thank you, Plaza, for having me.